Hey, what's up everybody? Chad here from Greyscalegorilla. In today's video, we're going to talk about Redshift. We're going to pick up where we left off with our mech shader. We're going to turn our mech into a Redshift proxy. And I'm going to show you some of my proxy workflows and a cool way to make an army of mechs. And then we're going to jump in and show you some of my favorite randomization techniques using Redshift. So without further ado, let's jump in. All right, so here we are in the old Cinema 4D, and we've got our mech going, and we've got it shaded the way that we had it shaded in our last video, and we're going to pick up where we left off. So we're going to talk about proxies. What are proxies? Well, proxies are kind of like baking down a mesh into a Redshift file format, the Redshift proxy, in order for it to load it at render time. It could load a very heavy mesh at render time. It's going to mean that your scene will be a lot lighter. It's going to be a lot easier for Redshift to manage a really heavy asset if it's baked out into a Redshift proxy. What's cool is that you can actually bake out Redshift proxies to, let's just go ahead and unlock that, to, it could be a still, it could be a moving mesh, it could be all sorts of stuff. And in this case, we're just going to have a still mesh, but this mesh could be moving, and I could bake out a Redshift proxy that takes place over a sequence of frames. It's really robust, and it's very similar to Arnold's AS file. I always love saying that name. It's just so ridiculous. But if you're familiar with Arnold's AS file, it's very similar to that. Okay, so let's say that we want to create an army of these mechs. We've got our mech here, and just for the sake of this demo, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the background so that we can just really concentrate on our mech. For this, we don't even really need the IPR going. In fact, I'll just stop it right here. And let's go ahead and make a Redshift proxy. So I'm going to grab the mesh, just grabbing the mesh, going over to File, going to go Export, and I'm going to come down to Redshift proxy. Okay. It's going to immediately ask me where do I want to put these things. I'm just going to throw it into my project directory here. We'll call this mech proxy, hit enter, and then you get this dialog. Okay, so this is the dialog that you're going to be met with when you're exporting something as a Redshift proxy. So you have the choice. You can export your selected objects or the entire scene's objects. But right now, I just want to do my mech, so I have that selected. I don't have any lights in here, so it's not really something I need to have checked on. Polygon connectivity, don't need that. Compressed data, yes, I do want that because I do want it to be a slightly smaller file. Proxy origin, do I want it to be object bounds or world bounds? It's already at world. Right now it's at world 0, so that's fine. I'll leave that on. Now this is the cool button right here, add proxy to scene. So what this is going to do is it's going to say, I'm going to make this mech into a proxy, and I'm going to add it back into your scene in one fell swoop. And I'm also going to remove, if you see here, I'm going to remove the object that you just exported. So it's like a one-click solution to replace your current object with a proxy that you're saving out. Okay. So if you come down to animation, this is what I was talking about before, where you could do the current frame, which is what we're going to do because it's not moving. No need to do all frames. Or you could do all frames if it's moving, like if you have a point cache or you have it animated. Maybe it's a MoGraph animation, could be anything. And then you could export a sequence, like a Redshift proxy sequence. So we're not going to do any of that because he's not animated. So we're going to go ahead and leave it at current. I'm just going to hit OK, and it's going to have a little progress bar down here. It's going to take a second, and you can see it's done it. It's replaced it with a black box. Very, very exciting. It's very quick in the viewport, as you can see, because right now it's just a black box. If I actually select the mesh, which it kind of creates this mesh for you up here, this Redshift proxy object. If I come over to its settings and I come over to display, you can see I can choose to say, do I want the bounding box on or off? If I turn it off, it's not going to show me anything. In fact, I have no idea what kind of space the mech takes up at all. So I'll usually leave that on, and I'll usually work in bounding box mode because it's actually the fastest. Or I'll work in a mesh mode, and this is going to load like a very kind of polygonal version of our mech. And I'll dial this down because we don't need to see this. What this does here, this preview percentage, it's going to decimate this mesh down to 10% of its original complexity, just so that in the scene, if you need to know where something is or if it's going to be penetrating with the ground or another object, it kind of gives you this ability to preview your mesh, which is kind of nice. But most of the time, honestly, I leave it as off and I leave it to show bounding box because that's the most efficient. All right, if we keep going down here on the settings, you can see here we've got materials from proxy file, or I can say object, or I can say scene match by name. Most of the time, I'm going to be using the materials that are in the proxy, most of the time. Now, there are occasions when you get a proxy in and you realize at the last minute, like, oh no, I need to change the material color, I need to change something. You could essentially turn on object and then put a shader on this. And in fact, let's just do that real quick. I'm going to go ahead and activate the IPR so that we can see what we're doing. As soon as I turned on materials from object, it turned gray because there isn't any materials on here. But I could easily come over here and say Redshift material and toss a material onto our mech. Let's go ahead and open that up and let's just give it a crazy color so that we can see what's going on. Okay, so you can see here, now we're using a shader that's in our scene. We're not using the proxy shader, the shader from the actual proxy, which is kind of nice. So if you need to change something at the last minute, you don't want to dive back into that proxy scene file, that's there for you. You can do that. Let's go ahead and delete that, and let's go back to the proxy file shader, which should load our grungy metal guy, which it does. Cool. All right. Walking down the settings here, overrides. The overrides are kind of powerful. What that does is, let's say in the proxy, you have object IDs set up for doing puzzle mats or something. So you could leave this checked off and it's going to respect all of the object IDs that are inside that proxy. Or if you wanted to create an object ID unique to this proxy itself, as the proxy is an object, you could turn this override on. And what that's going to do is it's going to say, okay, I'm now going to look at this proxy for my object ID, not the contents of the proxy. Same thing goes with tessellation and displacement. You could have that happen at the proxy level or at the sub-proxy level inside of the proxy. Same goes with visibility mat, object exclusions, and trace sets. Basically, everything that you want to override on the outside of the proxy file, you would do that here. Anything otherwise, if you leave it off, it's all going to be however you baked it into the proxy is how it's going to be. Okay, so I feel like that's a pretty good explanation. Also, we've got the animation controls, which isn't really applicable here because we don't have any animation on our bot. But here you'd be able to change how you want to interpolate your animated proxy. You could do simple, loop, ping pong, all kinds of stuff like that. It'll also detect the frames. So if you had a sequence, it'll automatically detect how many frames are in the sequence, which is pretty rad. Okay, I'll turn off the object ID. Okay, we've successfully made a proxy and we replaced it. So that's pretty cool. But what I want to do is create an army of mechs. And what's a good way to do that? Let me just move this over a little bit, give myself a little bit more room. Well, let's see here. I believe I already have a scene built, but let's start one from scratch. Let's go ahead and say new. And we're going to go over here to our little Redshift tab here and grab Redshift Proxy. And let's just navigate to where our proxy is to load that proxy file. I believe it's this one, right? Let's see. Where was that? Was that in here? No, it's going to be in here. There it is. Okay. So here is our file. And let's go ahead and turn on the IPR. And there it is in its ugliness because we don't have any lighting going on yet. In fact, while we're working on this, I'm going to work in clay mode. Now, clay mode, if you remember the render view video that I did, I like to work in clay mode quite a bit just to kind of, I don't know, just debug my scene, do a little lighting, figure it out. It's a little bit speedier. In fact, I don't think I even have IPR undersampling on, which I'll go ahead and turn that on. Be even faster now. Beep, 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 beep. Okay, cool. So we've got our mech. Let's go ahead and duplicate him around. I'm going to throw him into a MoGraph cloner, and you can see my MoGraph cloner, I've changed the default, and this is something I recommend doing. If you're like me and you don't like the cloner defaulting to a grid or one of the other modes, I like to default it to object mode. So I set mine to object mode. Let's go ahead and create a disk and scale the hell out of this. Actually, you know what? Let's just grab that disk and make it like I don't know, 3,500, and maybe 5,500. Fairly large. All right, so let's grab our cloner. Let's say instances, object, grab that guy, turn off align to clone, and let's increase this to maybe 350 bots. Okay, so now we've got 350 bots, pretty damn fast, loading up in this scene. And you can see how responsive it is. This is why proxies are important. If you have a high-res mesh and you want it to load fast and you don't want to speed up your speed or slow down your scene, proxy can really help you do that. I mean, we've got 350 bots here, and it's not struggling at all to keep up with this. So let's see if we can get some more in here. What if we make this, I don't know, 800? If we make 800, what is that going to do? It's no problem. Not a problem at all. Is our undersampling working? Yeah, it doesn't seem to. Sometimes it works and sometimes, oh, there it goes. So let's spread these guys out. Let's go ahead and grab a MoGraph effector. We're going to do a push apart. I'm going to raise my iterations to like 120 and maybe change my radius to like 150. I'm just going to spread, I'm just trying to spread these bots out as much as I can here without them looking wonky. That looks pretty good. It's 190. So now we're getting a pretty decent spread out of these mechs. All right. Yeah. Cool. So actually this looks pretty good. Now they just, in fact, I don't think they're really even like penetrating one another that much here. Let's see. Yeah, they look pretty good. Okay, so let's add a little bit of variation to them. I'm going to go to MoGraph. I'm going to say random, and let's just randomize them a little bit in X and Z and not at all in Y, and then I'm going to randomize their rotation by like 15 degrees so they're not like perfect. So let's go ahead and find a nice cool angle of our army of mechs here. Cool. That looks pretty good. I mean, that's pretty damn fast. Now, I'm kind of tempted to push it and see how far we can go. Because it'll top out at around, I've gotten this up to 2,500 copies of something pretty high res, and it's been okay. But I'm a little skeptical to do that during a live stream. So I'll split the difference. I'll take it up to 1,250. And for those of you that have used MoGraph before, you know that if you start to throw too many MoGraph clones into Cinema 4D, it will die. And that is just a fact. And especially, you know, if they're not proxies like this, they're going to really tax your system. But Cinema doesn't really have to think much about this because it's just loading these proxy files, these little bounding boxes. Redshift is doing all the heavy lifting down here, which you can see. It's handling it no problem. So right now we've got 1,250 mechs. Okay, I think that's pretty good. In fact, I'm content with staying right there and calling that a good amount. And cool. In fact, our ground is like, we've got so many, they're not even like staying on the ground. All right, so let's get out of clay mode and get back into regular mode. And let's light this up real quick before we move on, because I can't leave anything looking this ugly. Let's go over to light, grab our dome light and my favorite plugin of all time, HDry Link. Let's grab the dome light dome map, drag that onto the HDry Link tag, double click that guy, and let's change this to preview mode, and let's pick an HDRI, maybe something outdoorsy. Yeah, that's not bad. That's kind of cool, actually. Let's rotate that. Actually, let's bring the exposure up, and I kind of like that. It's kind of backlit almost. Let's go ahead and just rotate this like 20 degrees, 30 degrees. Ooh, even better, even better. Okay, cool. Let's do this. Let's turn that. I don't like that. I don't like seeing it in my viewport. I don't want that on. Actually, you know what? I'll leave it on the viewport because we're going to throw some depth of field on here maybe and make a nice little shot before we move on. Okay, we'll leave the background plate in. Let's grab a ground plane. I'm not going to use the same one that we just had in there because we've been using that for our distribution of our MoGraph. So let's change this to like 8,000, something to cover up the ground. I'm going to make the other disk not renderable, and let's just throw like a generic kind of material onto the new ground, and we'll just make it this gray. And I'll make sure it's not glossy though, so we don't want any reflections on our ground. Let's bring that to 0. Okay, cool. All right, we don't have any GI, we don't have any render settings of any kind. In fact, if I were to predict, I would say it's probably got my Arnold default, which it does. So let me just delete this stuff. Remove that. Boom. Let's rename this RS. And let's change the renderer to Redshift. And let's walk through. I kind of walked through my favorite way to set up render settings in a previous video, but I'm just going to do it really quickly here, and I'm not going to kind of talk through it too much. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to change my IPR to 64 samples so that it's very, very fast. I'm going to bring my min and max on my unified to 1 and 1. I'm going to go ahead and turn on bucket mode, and we're going to see where the samples are. I'm also going to enable GI. I'm going to do brute force and a radiance point cloud. 3 bounces of GI is plenty for a scene like this because there's really not a lot of places for the light to be bouncing around. I mean, some of the bounces in here maybe, but not that many, really. So first things first, I should have actually just double checked, turn off the GI and just double check the samples of my dome light. I'm just going to render region this area here because I can already tell it's going to give me problems. I'm just holding down shift and clicking into the IPR to get the render region going. All right, so let's increase our dome light samples by 2s. So I'm just hitting multiply 2, not going to be enough. Multiply 2, almost there. Multiply 2, pretty clean. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so you guys can see this a little bit better. All right, so let's go. I think 512 is probably clean enough, but you know, better safe than sorry. We'll do 1024. That's pretty damn clean. All right, now I can turn on some GI. So let's do brute force, a radiance point cloud. 3 bounces of GI is plenty for something like this. I don't even really see that much noise, but 16 rays, number of rays is really, really low. So let's just do 512. It's like just a safe bet for this kind of shot. Yeah, that's fine. That'll be fine. All right, let's go back out to our full view here. Let's do 100. Man, kind of bugs me that I can't hit double click that and have that work. All right, let's get out of render region or the cropped version, and let's just let this cook for a second. Really missing seeing that 4th bucket draw, but like I was saying earlier, I had to disable one of my cards because of the issue I was having with my webcam and streaming. That looks good, but it looks really crunchy. In fact, if I zoom in on this, you can see it's really crunchy, and the reason that is because in my basic settings, we've brought our unified sampling min max to 1 and 1, which is not going to be enough. So let's bring this up. Let's say, I don't know, let's go 256 and 16. And I'm just picking those numbers just off, you know, pulling them out of my ass basically, but it's kind of a good starting point for me on a scene like this. So we're just kind of zoomed in here to check the level of anti-aliasing. And that looks totally fine. 100, cool. All right, that looks pretty good. So now what I want to do is I'm going to jump back into progressive mode because I'm going to be doing some stuff on the fly and I don't necessarily want to wait for buckets to drop. And I'm going to put a camera in here and we're just going to look through that camera and I'm going to make it a fairly long lens. I'm going to say like a 70, let's do like a 70 mil. And let's tilt it up a little bit and just try to get some depth into this shot. Cool. And let's get a little bit closer to these guys. That's better. Cool. So we're going to throw some depth of field on here, and let's just kind of, I'm just going to walk this up a little bit so I can see the head of our front guy, but I don't want to I don't want to see him too much. It's kind of tricky because we're looking at proxies, but I might switch. Now might be a good time to jump into the proxy and go from this display mode, but I'm afraid it'll actually kill my viewport performance, so I'm kind of reluctant to do that. All right, let's raise it up just a little bit. I'm just trying to get this guy's head to show up a little bit. Okay, cool. All right, so let's throw a little depth of field on here before we call it done. And I also, you know, might as well brighten it up a little bit too. It's looking a little bit dim. There we go. That's better. Okay, so let's grab the camera. Let's grab a tag. Let's grab a Redshift tag, Redshift camera. Let's toggle down to the bokeh tab and let's enable it. And you can immediately see there's a little bit of it happening right here, but not very much. We're going to have the focal distance derived from the camera. So if I jump back out into, let's say, a top view. Oop, we forgot to lock our camera, so I can already tell it's going to try to draw that. Super annoying. I wish that just defaulted to locked, but whatever, man. Whatever. All right, so our focal point actually looks pretty good. I might move it a little bit closer to this front bot here, but that looks pretty good. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and start playing with the bokeh settings, which is just going to be the circle of confusion. I'm going to bring that up to like maybe 5, just to introduce a little bit of that depth of field. That's probably too much. It kind of makes them look miniature almost to me. All right, cool. So that's pretty good. So if we jump back into bucket mode, let's just go ahead and see what the speed is of that and make sure that we're not hitting any problems, because when you're doing depth of field and any sort of large amount of depth of field in Redshift, that's going to be all controlled within the unified sampling. There's no sample setting for doing the bokeh. So I think it looks pretty good. I think we set this up. I think we were pretty smart about how we set it up. Looks a little bit slow, but I can fix that. We can fix it. We can optimize. Yeah, I mean, it looks clean as hell. In fact, let's just make this a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to do fit window, and let's make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to go ahead and trigger my sample mode, which is going to show me exactly where Redshift is thinking about the pixels and the samples and all that goodness. So let this cook for a second, and we'll see what we need to decrease or increase. Wow, yeah, it's putting 256 samples in a lot of places. So anywhere where it's bright and white, that's where it's going to throw 256 samples at it. And anywhere where it's black, it's going to be throwing 16 at it. So right now, we're not nearly putting enough black on it. So it doesn't need, I don't want it to think this hard, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So I could do a couple of different things, but I'm going to do the easy thing because I want to move on. I'm going to just raise my adaptive error threshold, which is just going to tell Redshift not to think so hard about these pixels and just assume it'll start to default more towards that 16 samples more than the 256. Cool. It's already much faster. And to make it go even faster, I'm just going to increase the distance between these two, the 16 and the 512. And I'm going to also raise my adaptive threshold up, and that will definitely speed it up as well. And it should create a lot more dark areas. Yep, cool. Much faster already. And let's just jump out of clay mode, go into regular, or sorry, out of sample mode. Let's just let it cook on the arrays cache, the running as point cloud rather. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, looks clean, looks good. So we sped it up quite a bit actually, just by tweaking those settings. And since we're putting a lot more into the max of our samples, we could probably lower our dome light sample setting, and that would totally be fine. Anyway, so yeah, that's a good workflow, right? So let's just say somewhere down the line, you're working on this project and you're liking it, but somebody comes up and says, you know what, the robots, they're not yellow anymore. They're actually supposed to be gray, or they're supposed to be black or something like that. Okay, so what do you do? So, well, there's a couple different things you could do. You could grab that shader that we had and just copy and paste in the scene and do like I was talking about before, where you put it on the Redshift proxy and you change it from proxy file material to object material. But that's kind of boring. That's not very cool, because what if this was actually, well, actually, here's a better case scenario. Let's say this was actually used across a couple different shots and a couple different project files. You don't want to have to go in there and copy and paste the material in there every single time and like, oh my God, what a pain in the ass that would be. So what do? Well, let's just save this scene. I'm just going to do this quick save on this. And we're going to call this mech army yellow. Cool. And let's go ahead and close this scene file down. And let's jump back into this scene. I wonder if I can just undo in this scene to the point in which before I created this proxy. Otherwise, I'll just have to revert to saved. Let's just revert to saved. Forget it. Don't feel like messing with it. All right, so I'm going to jump back into the original scene that we made this proxy with, and I'm going to dive into that shader that we built in our last video, which if you haven't seen it, it's on Twitch. It'll be on YouTube soon, but we're a little bit behind on editing those, so I apologize. So let's make this gray. So let's change this kind of orange cat. It's almost like a, I don't know why I made this yellow. I guess I was trying to make it look like one of those cat tractor, like, I don't know, something about it just seemed kind of cool to me. All right, let's just make it gray. Let's make it like a dark gray. Okay, so we like this dark gray. And we're going to say, okay, cool. We've changed our asset here. Let's re-export it out as a Redshift proxy. Grab this guy, come over here, and we're going to call this, we called that first one mech proxy, but we're going to call this one mech proxy underscore gray. And all the same settings. Boom, boom, boom. Compress data. Yep, yep, yep. Remove. Actually, we don't want to remove. And let's go ahead and not add it back to the scene. Because why? We don't need it. We're not going to use it in the scene anyway. So hit OK. It's going to export. Bleep, blop, all that stuff. Let's jump back into our scene that we created, which is going to be our mech army yellow. Let's start the IPR. Let's get out of bucket mode. And we're in progressive mode. Give it a second to load up all of these guys. And now all I have to do is go into this cloner, grab the Redshift proxy, and just load in a different proxy, the proxy gray. And it should be like almost instantaneous, which it is. There it is. Cool. So now what we've done is sort of like an XREF workflow in that we created an asset and we saved an asset. And now that asset is the same in every place that asset is being used. So if this was if we had like 10 shots of these mechs and the client said they're not yellow, they're gray now, you wouldn't have to jump into 10 different scenes. You could just update this Redshift proxy very much like an XREF workflow. So that's kind of the proxy section of our stream here. So let's move on to the next thing I want to talk about, which is going to be some of my favorite techniques for doing randomization. I thought it'd be fun actually to do a scene that was in stark contrast to the kind of futuristic mech kind of scene and do something completely different, which is, let me see if I can find it here, which is going to be some fun stuff with our model pack that we sell at Greyscalegorilla.com, which is this awesome set of kind of very cool art-directed models called the Happy Toolbox model pack. So I've kind of put some of these models together in this little still life scene. It could be a product shot, could be a little background for something, but we're going to play with this and we're going to make these look like wooden toys, and we're going to use one shader for all these different objects, and we're going to use triplanar and randomization techniques to kind of make them all look a little bit unique and different. Who's down? Everybody down? Everybody still with me? Checking the chat here just to make sure everybody's nobody's asleep, hopefully. Grab your coffee. Cool. I assume that we're still rolling. Cool. Yeah, I'll answer all your questions about proxies and what stuff when I'm done. I just want to run through this next thing. Okay, so what are we going to be creating here? Let's go ahead and fire up the IPR. I'm in progressive mode. We've got a very faceted group of objects here. Some of them are actually pretty dense in terms of their topology, but a lot of them are very faceted. So we're going to talk about the Redshift object tag as well as the Redshift materials and randomization stuff. So first things first. We've got our psych background. We've got our lighting set up here. I want to subdivide these objects. They're very kind of low poly right now. If I look at this, actually, I'll just do it in here. I can show you the topology. Whoops, how the heck did I get in that mode? That's weird. Right? What the hell's going on? There we go. That was weird. So yeah, they're pretty low poly. So we need to subdivide these things. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab all these objects, go up to actually we don't need to do the clouds. Those guys are pretty dense already. I'm just going to grab these hierarchies. I'm going to go to tag. I'm going to say Redshift object. Okay, so let's go ahead and widen this out a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. So the Redshift object tag is a very versatile tag. It has a lot of different tabs, very important stuff. For this, all we're going to worry about right now is the geometry tab, and I'm going to turn on overwrite geometry. And I'm going to turn on tessellation. So as soon as I turn on tessellation, you're going to notice that these objects are going to tessellate. Boom, there they go. Now you can see my burger got all smooth and everything got all smoothed out. So the one thing that's cool and sort of, in my opinion, a little bit annoying at times is the screen space adaptive. So what screen space adaptive is doing is it's going to be subdividing your geometry based on screen space. So based on how close or how far away you are from it, from the camera, it's going to subdivide that. I don't like that. I prefer to have it be a uniform subdivision at all times, just because, I don't know, sometimes the other screen space stuff can be weird. So I usually turn that off, and I turn my minimum edge length to 0, which is going to say, okay, I'm not going to look at a minimum edge length before I subdivide this object, and I'm not going to use screen space. So you can see now that I'm doing a uniform subdivision of 6, which is way too much for these guys. In fact, if I did 1, it might even be enough. Let me just make sure I refresh this. Yeah, 1 is actually plenty for these guys. I'll do 2 just to be safe. Just because I like to play it safe sometimes. All right, cool. So these guys are subdivided, and that looks pretty good. In fact, I think that's enough. And you can see this other setting too, which this setting is pretty rad, I gotta say. The out of frustum tessellation factor. Basically, if anything falls out of the camera frustum, which is the field of view of the camera, that's the tessellation factor for that area, which is kind of cool. It's very similar to the displacement settings, which we'll get into in another video. All right, so we've got our objects subdivided. They look pretty good. Let's go ahead and build a shader. So I'm gonna grab a Redshift material. I am going to right-click and apply it to all these different objects. And there we have it, except it's not on our bubbles, our bubble clouds. So let's go ahead and apply it there. Cool. All right, so let's make wood. Let's go ahead and load this guy up, this shader graph. And there we go. And I am going to just start to load in some textures that I have made. So let's grab a texture, grab over here. Another cool tip, if you haven't discovered this already, you notice I dragged the word texture, the texture node, into the shader graph, and it immediately opened up an Explorer window. You can do that just by going over to the options and say auto request texture files and make sure that's turned on. And that'll automatically, I'll do it again just so you can see, that'll automatically, when I drag over this texture node, it's going to immediately open up a Windows Explorer to help me find that texture, which is really handy. Highly recommend it. So we're going to grab this pine texture that I made in Substance Designer. Now let's go ahead and look at that. We're going to publish this out to the surface. And you can see that these objects are have pretty good UVs on them. But it's not really how I want to run this. I want to make it a little bit cooler. I want to make it a little bit different. I appreciate that these are UV'd, Happy Toolbox, but let's just say that they weren't, and we needed to, I don't know, do our own. But we didn't have time to fully UV, so we're going to use triplanar. Again, triplanar, awesome, awesome, awesome mapping technique. So let's grab triplanar, drag that in. Let's connect our wood shader to the triplanar's texture X, and somebody on one of my last streams tipped me off to this. I didn't realize they added this, but it actually will put the same image on each axis unless you deliberately tell it not to, which is awesome. It saved me 3 clicks every time that I did this. Whoever gave me that tip, I hope you're in the chat because you are awesome. All right, so let's see what that looks like. Let's go ahead and publish this guy out. And let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. In fact, let's work in a fixed scaling, and let's do 70% so that we can see it a little bit better. And this guy will make 100. Cool. So you can tell it's really kind of hard to tell right now. So let's grab another thing I like to do is I like to make sure that I have a UV texture, which is going to be right here. I always like to make sure I have a UV texture on hand just so I can use that as a stand-in to tell what the hell my textures are doing. So this, and I just Google image search this one. I'm trying to find who made it and give credit, but I've had this for a while sitting in my library, but I recommend just kind of going on Google search and doing a search for like UV grid or something and find one that works for you. This one works for me. I like it a lot. It's got lots of cool colors, lots of cool little letters and numbers and such. So this is a good way to help me understand what my triplanar is doing. Right now I can definitely say that it's not going to be big enough, so let's go ahead and make it bigger. And again, the wonky Redshift scales are coming into play. I need to increase my blend. So if you look right here, it's blending between these two different projections, but not enough for my taste. So I'm going to actually increase that blend to make it blend a little bit more. Okay, cool. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. I think this will work. I think this will definitely work. But it's all too uniform. Right now, the mapping is uniform, which is not what I want. I want to create something with a bit more variation to it, and I don't want to have to work hard to do it. So what am I going to do? I'm going to grab a user data node. User data, I know it sounds complicated, but we're going to use a color user data, and we're going to choose from the object drop down here, geometry, color, ID color. And let's just pipe that into our output so we can see what that does. Now this is a quasi-random color per object in the scene. It's not well, from what I can gather and what I've been able to tell from the Redshift folks, is it's not true random, whereas Arnold has like a nice random that you can change the seed even after this node. This is like a quasi-random, but it's going to be good enough for what we're going to use it for. Okay, so what are we going to use this for? Well, we've got all these different colors, and they're all, different objects. So let's use this to our advantage. How can we use this to our advantage? This seems like an ideal sort of map or ideal node. So let's grab a ramp, which is, if you know, that's like one of my favorite types of nodes of all time. And let's look at the output of that, and let's make sure this is changed to alt space. So we've just converted this to a grayscale value just so I can we didn't have to do this, but I'm doing it just for my own eyeballs because I know that black is going to be 0 and white is going to be 1. So let's use these values to drive something. Let's grab a range. I'm going to say change range. I'm going to pipe this into my input, and I'm going to actually use it to drive something in my triplanar. I'm going to use it to drive the position offset of my triplanar. So we're going to take what's normally in this ramp, 0 to 1, and remap it 0 to 150. And now I'm going to use that range to drive the triplanar offset. And let's go ahead and look at the triplanar offset now in the output. And you can see each object is randomly offsetting its texture in this triplanar. It's great. It's awesome. It's exactly what I wanted. You can see now, let's go ahead and look at it without it. In fact, let's just disconnect it here. You know what? Let's disconnect it and do something cool. Bring it into a picture viewer just by hitting the little PV button. And let's go ahead and reconnect it right there. And let's grab that guy to the picture viewer. And now we can A/B. Look at that. We got some A/B action. So what I've done now is it's actually using the values to randomly offset the texture on an object per object basis. This is really powerful, and we can use this in a lot of different ways. So for right now, we're just using it to drive the position, but what if we wanted to drive the rotation as well? Just make it a little bit off axis maybe. Not really something that I would recommend doing for wood, seeing how wood is usually pretty straight, but let's go ahead and do it anyway. We're going to duplicate the Redshift change range. We're going to throw the ramp into the input, and we're going to change this range now from 0 to 150 to maybe 10 degrees, something like that. That should be good. And let's put that into the triplanar rotation. Let's see what that does. But now you see what it did? Gave us a nice little unevenness, little strange, little not so perfect. And that's really what I'm after here, stuff that's not perfect. Okay, cool. That kind of tackles the issue that I was having with all of my wood kind of using very similar similar texture coordinates, which let's go ahead and look at that. Put our wood back in there so we can really see. You can see that's why I use the UV texture, because if I would have done this with the wood texture, it would have been really hard to tell what was going on, been really hard to see. So using it this way definitely helps me understand what I'm looking at. All right, so the next thing I want to do is randomize the wood tone. Like I don't want each cut of this pine may have been slightly different tone, slightly different color. So I'm going to use a color corrector color correct. Boink. Let's drop this in here. Boink. And boink. Cool. And again, I'm going to be using this nice little geom ID color node to randomize some of this stuff. And we're going to grab another change range. Let's just pull that off of there. And we're going to do a gamma on this one. So we're going to go 0 to 1. That's fine. We're going to use that. Let's grab our ramp. Make sure it's all good. And the new range, I don't want it to be 0 to 10 because gamma 0 to 10 is going to be crazy. I'm going to make this pretty subtle, gamma 0.85 and maybe 1.25. And let's drive the gamma and see what that looks like. So it's pretty subtle, but let's go ahead and change it and make it not subtle just so you can see what it's doing. So right now I'm randomly affecting the gamma of these objects based on that color user data node that we had in there before. But right now, you can tell, which kind of is a little bit of a bummer, that it's affecting them all exactly the same because I don't have the ability to change the seed of this geo ID color user data. What I do have the ability, though, is to mess with this ramp that's remapping these values. So I'm going to pull this ramp off, and this is kind of a silly trick. It's probably not actually super awesome to do it this way, but whatever. I'm going to do it this way anyway. I'm going to invert, actually I'm going to double these knots, and then I'm going to distribute them and actually pull that one off and distribute them again. Okay, so I'm going to pull that color user data into this ramp, and you can see now I've given the ramp more opportunities to change its value, which is kind of my really hacky way of changing the seed. So here is the original, and here is this new one that I kind of hackily put together. I'm going to use that to drive the gamma version of our little change range down here, just so that we have a little less predictability in terms of what's going to receive this gamma change and what's not. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Actually, I'm pretty happy with that. Yeah, okay. So let's start building out the rest of the shader. Now I can actually start to mess around and let's move our, where's our material? There it is. Material somehow ended way over here. Let's pipe this guy into the diffuse color and pipe our shader back out so we can actually see what's going on. Cool, cool, cool. I think our gamma is way too blown out. I may have went too high on that. 1.1 I think is good, and then maybe 0.85. I want there to be a subtle difference, but not like a huge, huge difference in this wood. Cool, that looks good. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the, I don't know, I was going to do it to the saturation, but I kind of don't want to. I kind of like the way it looks, the way it is right now. I'm going to add a little bit more saturation into the wood. That looks pretty good. Okay, so let's go ahead, and now I'm going to pull in, let's see, what am I going to pull in? I'm going to pull in another texture, and let's go ahead and grab the bump map, which is just going to be this normal map here. Open that up, pipe that in here. Now you're going to want to make sure that you're using the same triplanar for your bump map, because otherwise it's just not going to line up. So I'm going to pull a copy off, which is a bit of a bummer that there's no, as far as I know, there's no way to pull this off and maintain the connections, which is a little bit of a drag. So you are going to have to come in here and actually kind of reconnect this stuff. If somebody in the chat knows how to do it, I know how to do it in Arnold, but I do not know how to do it in Redshift. Texture is not going to be there. It's actually going to be image. I know I'm working way too zoomed out right now, so I got to zoom back in. Otherwise, my brain's going to explode. All right, let's grab a, oh yeah, you know what also sucks? Well, actually, this is also kind of a bummer too, I think. I don't think I can actually do this with a normal map. I think I ran into this problem before, because the normal map is actually a node that requires like you to choose a path. I can't actually pipe in this into the normal map. So I think I actually, the way I was doing it before was actually with a bump map. It's just straight up detailed height map, which is totally fine for something like this. So let's grab a bump map, boom. Let's pipe this guy into the bump map, We're going to make this into our texture, put this into the RS material overall bump input, and it goes black. Why is it going black? Let's take a look. Maybe something broke. Whoa, that's totally jacked up. Not sure what's going on there. Offset, let's just change this stuff, get rid of that. Okay, so that worked, but for whatever reason, it was not feeling my offset or my rotation when I had them connected. But now it seems to be working fine. No idea what that was all about, folks. Another one of those Redshift mysteries, I guess. So I can't really tell exactly how much that bump map is affecting everything. So I'm going to change my resolution to 200%, and I'm just going to move that guy over there and just kind of see how far I can push this bump map before it really starts to annoy me. I think 2 is probably going to be way too heavy. So I'm going to do like a 0.1 and say that's probably pretty good. I'm also going to bring the glossy down on this a little bit. It's feeling way too shiny, so let's do like a 0.15, maybe something even higher, maybe like a 0.3. That looks pretty good. Maybe even higher than that, maybe 0.35. All right, cool. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And let's get rid of the crop, and let's bring this back to 100%. And let's center it up, and yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, for the burger, obviously, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use a triplanar method because you get this kind of weird area here where you see like all the different projections coming together, but for now, it's totally fine. All right, so we've got a pretty good shader. We have some control over our gamma, which I'm going to go ahead and change that even more now because I feel like I want it to be a little bit different. Whoa, not that different. Slow down, Chad. That's pretty good. Okay, cool. All right, so that's looking good. I'm digging this. Now I want to maybe add some depth of field. So we've got our camera. I've already got a camera tag on here. And the reason I have this camera tag on here, I'm going to show you what I'm doing with some of the exposure settings. I don't know if you've played around with these tone map settings or the exposure settings, but they're kind of cool. So if you notice I had them on, so if I turn them off, this is what the render actually looks like without any sort of trickery on the camera's part. Sometimes I will use the exposure setting in the Redshift camera to change exposure and maybe change a little bit of the saturation and also change my overexposure, my black crush threshold, all that sort of thing. So let's walk through what some of this stuff does. Basically, what you need to know about these 3 settings all just control exposure in a different way. So ISO works just like a regular camera. If I lower it, things are going to get dark. If I raise it, things are going to get bright. So that's what that does. And it's pretty, where was I on that when I first started? Must have been right there. Okay, cool. So shutter speed works the same way, and f-stop works the same way. If I bring this down to like a 1, it's going to be really bright. If I do like a 20, it's going to be really even dim. If I go to like 60, it's just another way to control the exposure. And I don't know, they're kind of arbitrary and they don't really mean anything. That's what's kind of annoying about them, but yeah, they can be useful in some situations. The white point is kind of cool because what you can do is essentially de-white balance or white balance your shot. Let's say we wanted to make this shot more cool. I would make it warmer in the white point. So now we've made the shot more cool. If I wanted to have the opposite effect, I would make the white point cool and then the entire thing gets really, really warm. And then the vignetting, I just kind of like because it's pretty. It just adds like that dark vignetting to the scene. If I make this 0, it's got no vignetting going on. It'll be a little easier here if I make this, if I zoom in, make this a little bit easier to see. And if I crank this up to like 100, we've got a lot of vignetting, way too much vignetting. I think I had it at like 10, and I thought that was kind of pretty. All right, cool. So the tone mapping stuff is a little bit different. So the tone mapping says, okay, what is the maximum of overexposure are you going to allow me before I start to taper off the exposure? If I set it to 0, and it's not really going to be visible on the scene because there's not really a lot of really blown out areas, you can see that it's not really having much of an effect. But if I start to crank this up, it starts to increase the amount that it's going to be allowed to overexpose. So I'm going to just walk this down until I like it. I think it was about 0.2 something is where I liked it. And the same thing goes with the black too. So the black right now, I'm not crushing at all. If I start to walk this down, you can see I start to increase my chance of being able to crush those blacks down. But I liked it where I had it, so I'm going to leave it right there. And then the saturation is just that. It's just like an overall scene saturation. Bringing it to 0 creates this black and white effect. I think I was at like 0.8 and I liked it. If you wanted to go crazy, you could make it like 2, and that looks horribly ugly, but whatever. All right, that's looking good. So let's jump into the bokeh. Let's go ahead and turn that on. We've already been through how to work with bokeh already, so let's go ahead and turn it on. You can see I've already got the focal point set to the this little front area here, this burger. So that's where I like it. In fact, I might increase it a little bit to kind of get more of a macro look, or more of like almost like a swing tilt lens. And yeah, that looks pretty good actually. And you know what? It's too much. Let's go back to 6. Second guess myself. All right. So far, recap. We've learned how to randomly offset texture coordinates using triplanar. We've learned how to randomly affect the gamma of the texture to create one shader that is used across multiple objects to make it easier and faster for doing lots of different objects where you don't want to have a million different shaders. The last thing I wanted to show you in this workflow is what happens if a client comes in and says, this is great, but that building in the back, this one right back here, we want that to be red. And you're like, okay, damn, like that just totally monkey wrenched my entire workflow. I'm going to have to create a separate shader now for that one building. This sucks. Not true. There is hope. There is hope. So what do we do for this? How do we make this work? Well, it's pretty easy. All we have to do is grab our Empire building, which is this building right here, go into the Redshift tag, go into Object ID, and we're going to give it a unique Object ID. In this case, we're going to make it 1. So we've given it a unique Object ID. Now Redshift says, okay, you know, everybody else either doesn't have an Object ID or has a different Object ID, but this building has an Object ID of 1. We can work with that. So let's go ahead and open up that material again, and now I'm going to grab a different user data node, user data color. Actually, in this case, I'm going to make it integer because this is a number. It's an integer. And we're going to come over here and we're going to say objects, object ID. Now, if I look at this output, it's not really going to show me. It's not even going to be able to, I don't think I can even output it. Oh, yes, I can. Look at that. That's cool. So I'm looking at the output, even though it's, for whatever reason, not drawing. Oh, it is drawing a noodle, but it's grayed out for some reason. That's weird. And I call these things noodles. I don't know. I think it's just something I picked up in my compositing days. So we have our building now is separated out. You can see it's looking out there. Object ID of 1. Cool. We can work with that. So let's grab a switch. We're going to grab a shader switch. Now the shader switch is really cool because it's expecting an input integer, and then it's going to output whatever that integer tells it to. So in our case, we want to make this guy red. So we want 0 to be black, and that'll make sense in a second. But I want 1 to be red. Now I'm going to come over to my texture, which is going to be this guy. And let's go ahead and look at the output of him. My hotkey for this, which you can set up the hotkey for right here. Connect node to output. My hotkey is set to Alt-WC. You can change it to whatever you like. All right, so here it is. Let's go ahead and grab a color. Correct. Actually, no, what am I doing? I'm going to grab a comp. Lost my train of thought there for a second. Let's grab a comp. This is going to be our base color. And this little user ID and this little shader switch, which is going to drive the selector. So our integer user data node is going to be driving the selector of our shader switch, and our shader switch is going to be the blend color of our composite. Now let's look at the output of that. And let's change the composite mode, just like in Photoshop. We're going to change it to multiply. So you can see here, oh, I was stupid, wasn't I? I didn't actually mean to make it black. I meant to make this guy white. Come on, Chad, you know better. All right, so look at that. We've now created a way to uniquely color our wood. So let's say, I don't know, well, actually I don't want it to be completely, get rid of the wood grain. So let's just make it a little bit red like that. Let's say now we can connect this up to our, this is getting a little bit messy, but bear with me. So now I've connected that back out to where it should be, into that color correction. We can look at the output, and now we have a red building. So now we have this cool ability to change the color on the fly of any of these objects. So let's say the client's like, cool, you made that building red. Well, we forgot to tell you that the forklift also needs to be red. So cool, that's all right, we can handle that. We'll just give it an object ID of 1 as well. And let's go ahead and resend this. And there it is, red, perfect. And then the client's like, yeah, cool, but one more thing, the trees should be green. Okay, well, I wish you would have told me that like before I started this, but all right, we can work with that. So let's go back into our shader switch and let's make a green color. And that we already know is going to be in, I believe that's going to be in shader 2. So whatever, we just need to make all of our trees. Let's grab all of our trees here, which I think is only 2 groups actually. Is it only the 2 groups of trees? Yes. And let's make sure those are on 2. And let's just go ahead and refresh our IPR. Oh, those trees are green. But you can see we've got some trees inside of this factory here. I think it's our factory. Is that what that is? Where is this guy at? Oh, those are tanks. Those aren't trees. Well, that explains it. I thought those were trees. Well, if we wanted to make them trees, because they look like trees to me, I'm going to go ahead and give them, I'm just going to control click this Redshift tag onto these tanks. And I'm just grabbing these guys. And I'm going to turn off the factory. I'm actually just going to drag this down here, and I'm just hitting control and dragging. I'm just making these not existing on the hierarchy level. They're going to exist on the object level now. And so if I refresh this, our tanks should be green, which they are. Perfect. Awesome. So we still have one shader. Man, why do I keep opening up that window? Okay, so now we still have one shader driving all the stuff. We still have random textures or random placement of the textures. It's all very procedural still, and we can change these colors on the fly. If they're like, oh, you know what, that green, it needs to be less saturated, not a problem, we can do that. So just working like this is a really smart way to sort of randomize textures in your scene and randomize things. Hopefully someday I'd like to see Redshift implement a UV node, which would make the offsetting of textures on a UV level much easier across multiple materials and multiple shaders. But for right now, this is a great technique using triplanar. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one. Next one, I'll be doing some Arnold stuff. So if you're into Arnold, or maybe you're just curious how stuff works in there, or you're using something else, drop by, check it out. It's not for a while, but we'll see you then.